Everybody was dancing in the moonlight, dancing in the moonlight. Everybody was feeling warm and bright. It's such a fine and natural sight. Everybody was dancing in the moonlight. No, we're not talking about one-hit wonders from the 70s. No, we're not talking about A Walk to Remember. Today, our topic is the very first TV show we've ever done on Pop Culture Catechism. We're talking about The Umbrella Academy. Let's go. Welcome to Pop Culture Catechism, where we take a look at art from pop culture and uncover the true, good, and beautiful elements found therein. Let's get started. Welcome to Pop Culture Catechism on AWAKEN Catholic. You can support this show and other shows like it on AWAKEN Catholic by going to awakencatholic.org and becoming part of the AWAKEN Nation by choosing to donate on a monthly basis. Any little bit you can give helps keep this studio running and helps keep shows like this keep happening. You can also do a one-time donation. We also now have the AWAKEN app where you can have access to all the shows and lots of cool content. And if you are part of the AWAKEN Nation and make that monthly donation, you also get premium content through the AWAKEN app. Another way you can support us is through downloading the Hallow app. If you're looking for a way to jumpstart your prayer life, Hallow is an awesome way to incorporate meditative prayer into your prayer life. You can do it in the car. You can just put in your earbuds and do the Rosary or do Lectio Divina. They have the voice of Jesus from the Chosen TV series doing some meditations. It's really cool. My wife uses it all the time. Lots of the staff here at AWAKEN use it. So go to hallow.app/awaken and you can get a free month of premium, and that really helps us out. So that's an awesome way you can support the show. And of course, you can always subscribe, like, share, hit that little bell on YouTube, give us a rating on iTunes or Spotify, write a review. All that stuff helps share the show. Today we're talking about Umbrella Academy. So if you know anyone who binged this show and loves it, please share this episode with them. My guest today, I'm so excited to have this guy on all the way from the Era in Middle Earth. We have Gimli, son of Glowin, here with us. No, I'm just kidding. We have Tony Vasinda, who is Tony. Welcome to the show. And I'm going to let you introduce yourself because you do so much cool stuff. You're involved in youth ministry. You're an entrepreneur. You're involved in games and tabletops, and you just moved across the country recently, and you're involved in all sorts of cool ministry. And tell us about yourself.
I love it because it's also always like you have a short attention span. You do way too many things. Whether you're doing any of them well is easily questionable. No, my name is Tony Vasinda. I am and was a longtime youth minister who, through the course of that, ended up starting a ministry that helped support other youth ministers, Project YM, that I helped build over the course of the last couple of decades, and then recently stepped back from during the course of time there, starting kind of as a lark at a conference. We started making beard balm that was inspired by the Catholic tradition, and that grew into a company called Catholic Balm Co., where we make lip balms, lotions, beard balms, and other products that are daily reminders of our universal call to everyday holiness. And that's actually my full-time gig now. When I stepped away from Catholic Balm Co., I started paying myself a salary from that for the first time. In addition to that, I do game design work. We have a game called Brand Standing. It's a storytelling brand building game that we're getting ready to relaunch on Kickstarter, and successfully created a beard-based RPG because I know how to make my niches cross over each other.
That's awesome.
Recently. So I'm a huge fan of tabletop stuff, do a lot of tabletop content and creation, and even make some tabletop inspired beard balms under the brand
That's
Plus
awesome.
One EXP. But we moved to Philly about a year ago because for years I would tell people, hey, if you want to work really closely with a group of 6 to 8 teenagers, there's a role for that. That role is called small group leader. That's not what a coordinator or director of youth ministry at a parish typically does. If you only have 6 to 8 youth in your parish, that may be different. But if you really want to be investing directly in the life of teens, be a small group leader. And I would constantly have people come to me when I was working at a parish as a director of evangelization and outreach, and just say, hey, like, I feel really called to do this. The parish should have a ministry for that. And kind of had to push back and say, like, why does the parish need to have a ministry for any of us to live out our unique callings?
Amen.
If you feel called directly to do something, you should go do that.
Yeah.
And we can have bigger conversations about whether the parish should be involved, but you've got to realize that actually puts a lot of things on you
Yeah.
and doesn't necessarily give you all of the support that you're hoping it's going to do. A lot of times people are looking for the emotional validation of saying, does my parish see me and support me and know what I'm doing? Or does the parish think this thing that I feel called to is important? And so with all those things kind of together, I love talking to people about the faith. I love talking to people who are far from God about the faith. I love sitting down with a board game or a beer. That is a fly on my head. I'm not my pen. Sitting down with a board game or a beer or a cup of coffee and just talking about who they are, what they do, getting to know who they are, understanding what they think about life and faith, and talking about what I believe about life and faith, and looking for the kind of resonant moments of goodness, truth, and beauty. And so I was running really successful evangelization programs. We had hundreds of adults every year who were going through the programs that we were doing. But I hate coordinated evangelization programs. What I love doing is talking to people about the faith. So quit my job. We moved across the country to Philly, started working at Catholic Balm Co. full time, and started something called the House of Broken Loaves, where really our desire is just to follow the great commandment to love God and to love our neighbors in the way that he told us to. And this is kind of a grand experiment in the middle of a global quarantine to see what that all looks like and what that actually feels like when you start to do it in a more intentional way. And not to turn people into projects, but just to say the neighborhood is our mission ground. Like we're really incarnating what God intends the church to do in a very small subsection of our parish. And there's been tons of blessings, even as we've kind of had to go way slower than we anticipated because of quarantine. So that's the short. I mean, the super short is go to TonyVasinda.com and you can see like everything I do for the most part laid out on one page.
Yeah, I love it. I love it. And that's so important, that relationship. I think a lot of times we forget that, spreading the gospel and being Christians, a lot of times it's just about relationships and getting to know people. So I love that you're doing that. And God bless you on that. Let's talk a bit about Umbrella Academy. So this show, if you don't know, it was one of the top shows on Netflix. It's got 2 seasons so far. The last season just came out this summer, and this past summer, 2020. And it's based on a comic book that was developed and written by the ex-lead singer of My Chemical Romance. His name is Gerard Way. I'll throw his picture up there. And he started doing this comic book, and then it got picked up as a Netflix series. And so the music in it is really cool. And I played Dance in the Moonlight. One of the epic scenes from the first season features that song. And it's just the way he uses music throughout this series. It's really creative. I was trying to explain it to somebody the other day. They're like, what is this Umbrella Academy thing? I was like explaining it, and they're like, it's kind of like X-Men. And I was like, yeah, but like weirder than X-Men. It's like quirkier and it's got a kind of a weird, quirky, goofy X-Men in a way, but also darker somehow. So they've had two seasons, one in 2019 and then one in 2020, and it's just a cool show. So what we're going to do here, we're going to talk about kind of what we love and don't love artistically, and then we'll get kind of into some of the spiritual themes of it. Sound good?
Absolutely.
Cool. So what do you love about this show? When I reached out to you about being on this show, you said this is one of the topics you wanted to talk about. So what do you love about this show?
Well, you sent me the list, and I really appreciate this being the first one where it hasn't been about music. I oftentimes feel like the part of my brain that appreciates the music in the way a lot of other people do doesn't work. Like I love lyrics and I love music. I'm not, but like when somebody's like, "What's your favorite song?" I'm like, I don't know. Like it's not anything that there's others with me, but like shows and comic books and other stuff like that are loved. I actually love that this is a story of a comic book that became a show for a number of reasons. I remember slinking down in the stacks at Borders, which people might not even know what
I
it
remember
is anymore.
Borders, yeah,
right? It's like a Barnes and Noble. And pulling this off the shelf while I was waiting for my mom to pick me up once in high school and reading through the first bound graphic novel series of the Umbrella Academy, and thought this is a really interesting thing. It was really phenomenal. I didn't make it through the entire thing. I remember when the second series dropped because it wasn't like one after the other. There was a bit of a pause. And it's kind of cool to see for me always how somebody takes one medium and translates it into another one. That's always something that's deeply exciting to me. So it's a property that I loved. I thought it was really creative. I love the dark, gritty feel of like what I would typically in the like comic book world is referred to as street level superheroes, which definitely is where Umbrella Academy falls. They within their world are these incredibly powerful individuals, but in a lot of other comic book universes would be very minorly powerful. You know, they are they're not necessarily these huge world bending, world breaking powers until they are sometimes.
Yeah.
And so I just love that story. And I love the interplay of complex family dynamics. Some of my favorite stuff from some of other scenes, like I never was really one to gravitate towards like Superman, even Batman with kind of his like darker feel, never was really a superhero that attracted me, but like Green Arrow, who has a little bit more complexity in a lot of his relationships, and Green Lantern, not nothing to do with the color green, it's just where it is, where creativity is a huge capacity of how they execute their powers and their abilities, are actually things that really always, like, I was super excited about. I love Spider-Man as a kid, because even though he's this big superhero in the city, he's not incredibly powerful compared to a lot of the people he faces. And so watching the interplay between these really broken human beings, because they all are, they all have all these family wounds. So if you're reading it as a teenager for the first time, there's this immediate attraction to a character in the story, whichever one it is. And you know, this ability to say even these small powers can be used in some incredibly dynamic and creative ways. I also love that they don't try to over explain how any of these powers work or reduce them to laser beams that just shoot out of stuff. Like they don't fall into either side of that, and I really love that.
Yeah, it's really just, it's unlike a lot of the other comic book stuff, like Marvel, like the Avengers, the big Marvel movies, and in X-Men, which is kind of what I grew up with. And I never read these comics, but I love the show. It took me a little while to get into the show. I had several friends that were like, "You got to watch Umbrella Academy. Season 2's coming out. You gotta watch it." And my wife and I were watching the first couple episodes, and it seemed a little bit slow. Like I felt like the first few episodes they could have trimmed like 10 minutes off of each one. But I texted my friend. I was like, does this pick up? Do they explain a little bit more? He's just wait for it. It's a bit of a slow burn. And I'm so glad I did. Like just the pacing and the characters and just the way that it's shot is really artistic. And like I said, the music and just, it's really artfully, creatively done. It's kind of got this steampunk aesthetic in places. And again, the music, and it's just weird and zany. And it's got a little kid who's actually an old man. And then it's got these, you know, sometimes you get visions of them when they're young and then visions of them when they're older. So it's really, it's really neat. By the way, we're going to have a bunch of spoilers. So if you haven't watched seasons 1 and season 2 before watching this, you might want to, you know, save this for later and come back to it, because we're going to talk about spoilers. Is there anything?
The retro futuristic aesthetic though is like off the charts, like that dark, heavy feel. And you know, it's really funny whenever you try to compare it to people about other things they've seen. One of the best things that it actually compares to is some like the Incredibles, like the way that they take very futuristic concepts but make them look very old and very dated. It's the same thing, but it's way more academic and way more like dark than that feel. But it's really funny when you try to just define and nail down that aesthetic for people. How much I think for a lot of us that look back at like something that feels like classic 1950s Americana, but totally twisted and pushed into the future is always super enjoyable.
Yeah, it's very cool. It's very cool. Well, let's, for people that haven't watched it, or maybe people who have, let's just roll through the characters, and I'll put the pictures up there. So there's 7 main characters in the Umbrella Academy, and they're all born on the same day. And the weird thing is their mothers weren't pregnant at the beginning of the day, and there's all of a sudden are pregnant and are giving birth all of a sudden. And this happened like all over the world to a bunch of kids. And this guy named Reginald Hargreaves gets 7 of these kids and adopts them. And I think he actually buys them from their parents. And realizes they have powers and raises them as kind of this X-Men superhero force. He's kind of a twisted Charles Xavier type who's not nearly as nurturing. And then he numbers them 1 through 7, and he always refers to them by their numbers. And in the show, they don't really have comic book names, but these names are from the comics. So the first guy's real name is Luther. He's number 1. The comics, they call him Space Boy. Diego, number 2. In the comics, they call him the Kraken. And I'll tell you superpowers too. Luther is super, super strong. And at one point gets spliced with a gorilla. So he's like big and hairy and huge and strong like that. Diego has like perfect aim with daggers and knives, and he can throw stuff and kind of make them bend and go wherever he wants. Allison, number 3, the rumor. She can control people's minds by saying, I heard a rumor that you punched yourself in the face, and the person has to punch themselves in the face. And so she's got a lot of power there, kind of like Kilgrave from Jessica Jones, if you've watched that. Klaus, number 4, the seance. He can communicate with the dead. He can see dead people and talk to them. And he's still kind of discovering his powers in the show. 5, who's my personal favorite. I love 5. They just call him the boy. And he doesn't, like, you never learn his real name, at least not in the TV show. But he can time jump and space jump. So he jumps into the future, but he's still trapped in like his 13-year-old body. So he's like a 50-year-old man. He's the oldest of them, but a lot of times they treat him like a little kid because he still looks like a little kid. And the actor that plays him is just amazing. Like he's so good. I could watch him all day. Ben, number 6, the horror. He has kind of these weird spirit tentacles that come out and like grab people. And he dies fairly early on, but he's still in the show because Klaus, who can communicate with the dead, has him with him, and their powers kind of interact in a weird way. And then number 7, Vanya, the white violin, who has no powers at first. And it's kind of a big thing when she develops powers and turns out to be the most powerful of them all. But it turns out their father, who adopted them, Reginald Hardgreaves, had actually suppressed her powers. And so it's a big thing when she discovers them later on. So I want to just kind of talk through, I don't know if we'll get to all of them, but we'll see how many we can get to, let's just talk about these characters kind of, because each of them has kind of things that they struggle with in ways that they're broken, but also like really beautiful things about them. So, Tony, is there a character that you just love that you want to talk about first?
So I love 5. Like you mentioned, he's just I think one of the most enjoyable characters. He's also the most unique. Like you mentioned, we never learn his name, and he doesn't have a superhero name. Even in the show, basically they've gone through being public superheroes. So a lot of their names are drawn from what people in the public called them. Their number is what Hargreaves always referred to them, and their name is actually a point of self-chosen identity, which actually makes 5 a really kind of interesting character to start on, because he doesn't ever pick a name. Like he's just 5 the entire time. He's referred to as the boy by everybody, but even as he goes through, because like he grows up, like we see this in an alternate timeline as this interesting cross-time assassin, right? Like he's this incredibly gifted and skilled individual who can time travel, but ends up in all kinds of trouble for it. He's the worst at controlling his power, but has one of the potentially most world-breaking powers. But he never dissociates, and this is really interesting to me, the identity he's given by his father, even as flawed as his father is, from being his core identity. Like he never, like the rest of them, feels the need to push who he is off onto someone else. Now, he also opens up as the least mentally stable of all of the characters, except for Klaus, potentially, right? And so he's a really interesting and fascinating character who we also see trying to navigate the world in a lot of ways, constantly through a middle schooler's perspective. But also then later in the series through a middle schooler who also happens to be like a 65-year-old. And so as somebody who loves middle school ministry, as somebody who that was of my heart and a lot of what I loved, like there's something about 5 that is just, I think, deeply endearing, as him being the most capable individual. Sure, the one who's typically the most aware of what's happening, but also the least able to get anyone to take him seriously. Which for me, like as somebody, like I said, with a background in middle school ministry, just kind of resonates. So 5 is absolutely tops for me also too. I also just love good dialogue, and 5 has some of the best dialogue.
Yeah, he does. He does.
Like his language use is phenomenal.
Yeah, I feel like as a middle schooler, I felt like I was the only one that knew what was going on, even though I didn't. So.
That's what I'm saying. Like, and I think it is really interesting. Like, there is the perception that comes with the youth that sometimes is actually more grounded in reality, because it's not formed as well, and therefore it takes in a whole lot more. And there's honesty and truth that it picks up that an older perspective will just gloss right over. That's why middle school students are so keen to like notice the one thing you didn't think about in a perfectly prepared talk or whatever. whatever else it might be. But I think we can all resonate with being that really frustrated teenager. The best thing about 5 is he's never blaming. I mean, as much as he does directly blame people when things are their fault, sometimes even when they're not, he doesn't place a lot of false blame on other people, which I think every single other character in the show is looking for someone else to solve their problems.
Yeah.
And 5 is actually looking to take control and solve things themselves. Now, maybe sometimes you should release a little bit of that. But he is the most active and proactive individual in the entire family who's not seeking to force other people into something also too. So in a lot of ways, 5 is the truest of all the characters. And that's actually, I think, one of the things that I love the most about him is he just is who he is. He presents himself as being, and he takes responsibility for the pathway of action that he wants to see happen and focuses on strongly executing in that direction. And so I think compared to a lot of the other characters that might frustrate me who want to wallow, that's absolutely who 5 is, and that's one of the things that makes him different than everybody else.
Yeah. So with 5, I love everything you just said. And 2 things that it makes me think of are one, you're right that he is the most proactive, and in sometimes almost to a fault. And I think about in my own life and in the life of my friends, sometimes there can, I think when you're trying to live the life of faith, there's such a thing as like kind of being almost lackadaisically trusting in God. Like it's not authentic trust in God, but it's just kind of, oh, God will take care of it. And that is almost an excuse for some people to not be proactive or just be like, oh, God will take care of it. But then there's a danger in that, but there's a danger on the other side where we don't trust God enough and we feel like everything depends on us. And if I don't do it, then it's not going to happen. And I can't trust this other person to do it because they're not trustworthy. And if I see 5 kind of obsessing with that, and there's not really any explicit reference to faith in that. But as I'm thinking about 5 and where I see him in myself is sometimes I want to kind of micromanage. Sometimes I want to have control over everything and kind of plan everything out. And his whole thing is he's trying to change the future, this thing that seems almost inevitable. And he's trying to figure out how it works. And sometimes even in my prayer life, I'm like, all right, God, I pray for this thing, because if this thing happens, then that thing happens. And if that thing happens, then that thing happens, rather than just saying, God, here's my heart and I trust you with it. You know what I mean?
I do think 5, and this probably comes from him. He avoids basically a lot of the late teenage trauma of his family's fallout. While engaging in a completely different type of trauma.
Lots of other trauma.
Being on his own. He actually has faith that his family can do something good, that he and his siblings can accomplish certain things. And again, he has, one of the most powerful abilities, potentially the most powerful. We could get into weird power arguments if we want to, but I don't think we do. But he is the least capable of using it in any sort of effective manner on a meta scale. Like small things, moving around a room, totally easy. Traveling through time is a huge plot point. His inability to do so well is a major element of this, and it's really kind of just cool to see his belief in his siblings kind of be the only thing that sometimes even moves them forward. And when it doesn't work, he's willing to go basically create a problem or try to solve a problem that ends up drawing them into where they need to be. So he's absolutely, I think, the pushing force behind the most of what happens in Umbrella Academy. So
I agree. I want to talk about Luther. I think Luther is, and I want to talk about because he's kind of the character. One, I kind of relate to him the most, but I also think he's my least favorite of all the 7.
I think that's pretty common for characters we see a lot of the time. Like we really love them. There's ones we love, we want to be like. The ones we don't like, we see ourselves in a lot of the time. Yeah.
So he's number 1. He's supposed to kind of be the leader, and he very much wants to please his father. He wants to go on. When everyone else leaves, he's the one who stays and keeps doing Umbrella Academy missions. But then once he realizes that his father, like his father like sent him to the moon to send back samples. And then he realized that the samples weren't even being used for anything. His father just thought he needed a purpose or something like that. Right. And so he's totally disillusioned, and he kind of mopes around a lot, kind of looking for his purpose after that, ends up working as a bodyguard for a gangster. And I don't know, I see so many people, and I see this within myself, is there's somebody that you want to make proud. There's somebody that you want to please. And maybe it's your father, or maybe it's a girlfriend or a boyfriend, or maybe it's, you don't even know who, you know, a certain clique you want to be a part of. But I just see he's just searching for that approval. And I know for me, that's been a major struggle through a lot of my life is, even when I'm doing the right thing, a lot of times I'm not doing it for the right reason. I'm doing it because I think it's going to gain me some sort of approval. And I see that so much in Luther.
And I think the other interesting thing, Luther is somebody who desperately wants to be loved. Like we see that we see that obviously with Hargreaves' father. We see that with his sister. And again, I remind people they're not biologically related siblings.
Yeah.
Even though it's weird because they did grow up in the same household. So we can talk about that in a little bit. But there's a desire for a relationship there. I even think with Diego, with number 2, a lot of their fight back and forth is a desire for Diego's admiration.
Yeah.
And from Diego, the same thing from Luther. This kind of fraternal rivalry that oftentimes exceeds the bounds of fraternity is Luther and Diego looking for mutual respect, love, and admiration from each other. But I think Luther ultimately embodies I'm somebody who wants to be loved, but feels totally unlovable, especially post his transformation. The thing I hate the most about the show version of Luther is how badly they did his body in the first season. That is 100% what I love the least about it. The amount of effort they put into making him have an ape body is so low and so bad in the first season.
It looks kind of like it looks like he's wearing styrofoam, kind of.
Yeah, like they just have him in a bulky suit a lot of the time to not have to pay money for stuff, I guess. I don't know. And but even that is done very, very poorly. And so it's just but he feels unlovable because of abandonment issues at first, but then this external transformation that mirrors this internal feeling of unlovability becomes this thing that causes him to totally self-isolate, to desire. In the comic books, there's a little bit of an implication, not only that he's put on the moon and left there, when he realizes it's fake, he just stays there because it is better to have a purpose, and he just wants not, and he doesn't want to have to be rejected by anybody again. Like there's some really like insane depth to Luther that I feel like we miss in the show a lot.
Man. Well, and how often do people stick with something long after they know it's worthwhile, just because they're afraid to try something new? And I know I've done that in relationships where it's like, this relationship really, I should be done with this, but it's hard to start over, or a job. You know, there's so many situations where you know in your heart that this is not good for you anymore, but you persist in it just because it's scary to start over, and people get trapped in that.
How many organizations get trapped in doing something they know doesn't impact what they're supposed to be doing, but continue to do it because it's just what they've always done. And if we tried something new, what if it didn't work?
How many parishes? How many churches?
I think Luther basically we see as a very, like, he never confronts a lot of that stuff. And I actually don't even think by season 2, like that he's really confronted most of it. He's acknowledged most of his desires, but he hasn't actually taken the active step to say, am I going to actually do something about him? The only time we see him do that, and this is absolutely a spoiler, for a really cool scene in the movie, so skip the next 30 seconds if you want to. The only time we see him do that in the first season, gets ripped back in time and erased immediately after it happens. And so, it's incredibly tragic.
Yeah, absolutely. And Diego kind of has a little bit of that middle child syndrome where he wants to be the leader. He wants to be what Luther is, or is what Luther is trying to be. And there, absolutely, he's fighting for approval. And whereas, Luther is looking for it from a father figure, Diego is looking for it from his mother, and their mother is like an android who just takes care of them, and he has this special relationship with the mother. But the mother is like not quite like it's not like Data from Star Trek, where she doesn't pass the Turing test, if you know what that is. Like she doesn't quite have like consciousness in the way that a human does, it seems, at least not in the movie.
It's way more Stepford Wife than it is anything else.
Yes,
right?
exactly.
They haven't passed the uncanny valley.
Exactly.
It's this 1950s kind of emoted mom. We find out later on the origin of who this mother is, and actually the way it works in the comic books is a little bit different, which is one thing I love. I love continually in this series how they tell kind of the same core story between both, but they don't stick to the same beats at all, which I think when you switch it up, you have to be okay with. And but mom is such an interesting character because she is designed to be the fully nurturing, ultra maternal, like idealized version of a mother who is ultimately also just artificial, like
Yeah.
does not exist as an entity other than whatever emotional energy these children have put into her. And so
Wow.
it's absolutely like crazy to kind of see some of the reality of how they do that. But yeah, I actually really like Diego. Again, he's a more active character. He wants to see things do it. He's an interesting like mix between some of the things that I love about the other siblings, but also ultimately isn't as physically capable, isn't as mentally capable, like constantly finds himself a being in this place of being number two and being more of a jack of all trades type of character. He's definitely got the spy assassin vibe going on. And but again, for him, he doesn't see a lot of self-worth. Like Luther has self-loathing, but sees value in his strength. Like Diego doesn't see that anything he does is good enough compared to anybody else, but wants to be honored and respected and revered as if he was. And so it's just one of those interesting things. It's also an interesting ploy. Like there is very much a prodigal son reality to Diego. Like if I had to guess who was the first person to be like, I'm gone, I'm out of here, like it was Diego, like 100%. Like, you know, just the restlessness of his nature absolutely screams that to me.
I really loved the romance between him and Lila. I think her name is, the handler's daughter. There's big spoilers for season 2. And at the end, he like lets her go and they're like, why'd you let her go? And he's like, cause I love her. And I was like, yes, I knew he really loved her. And I hope that something happens there. Yeah. And especially because the police officer that he was in love with in the first season ended up getting murdered. And he's had this kind of broken relationship with his android non-human mother. And then his girlfriend got murdered, or his ex-girlfriend got murdered. And then Lila, he has this kind of back and forth relationship with. And I just see him longing for this like healthy female relationship with a female. And it keeps just being just out of reach. So I really hope he and Lila can have something healthy, although they're both kind of messed up in crazy ways. So I'm sure they'll have some dysfunction in it, but I have great hope for Diego.
And I love that because we don't know. Like that character is nowhere in the comics. Like we have no idea what's going to happen with any of that. And I love it.
Let's talk about Allison. So she's got the mind control ability, and she's kind of, when we first meet her in the show, she's sworn it off because she's abused it. She used it on her child to, like, you know, get her child to sleep. She said, I heard a rumor that you went to sleep. And as I'm watching this, my wife and I both have 2 young children who are not very good at sleeping. And we like looked at each other and we're like, we would probably totally do that.
We would have made bad choices if we had this power. Yeah, I think on surface level, Allison has the most powerful ability, right? Like it seems the most evidently powerful because it's not just the convincing nature of you have to do it. Because if we look at things like, okay, go to sleep, well, there's a level of physiological control. We also see later on her tell somebody that she heard their heads exploded and then their heads explode, right? So it's her ability to warp reality based on her force of will, which is like insane. And we see the way this is abused by her father with one of her siblings, and then she mirrors that with her own child later on, and that breaks her from this. Even as she comes back to her powers, we see her then lose them for a period of time due to an injury. Also, like there's this kind of constant back and forth, which is also great writing because it never feels super contrived. Because a great solution to a lot of problems would be, we'll just have Allison tell them that it's different than it is, and that solves the problem. And her inability to do that, or her choice to not do that, creates good dramatic tension as a reason to not. No, I love Allison. This is when we said that her and Luther, there's a romantic relationship there that would kind of existed as they were kids, was a level of flirting as they were teens, is kind of mutually unacknowledged in the show until they get to be a little bit older, even though there's a little bit of acknowledgement about it, I guess, in those teen years. It's a really interesting dynamic that they kind of explore in this. We're actually going right now with a bunch of men through a men's thing that we do every year called the Nazarite Challenge. So it's like a spiritual No Shave November thing, right? We just broke them into a quote from the Book of Songs, right, that talks about the primary way that we love any woman is as a sister.
Mm.
And for a lot of guys in that group, especially married guys, the question is like, for single men, do you see other women as sisters first, or do you see them only as objects?
Yeah.
For married men, do you see your wife as a sister in Christ? Do you understand
Mm-hmm.
how to love them? And then for priests, what does it mean for you to be, because it's all dependent on the vocation. What does it mean for you to love the women in your parish as a sister? Like,
Yeah.
how is that being honored as well as being their spiritual father? So it is overwhelmingly, most men are like, that's really hard.
Yeah.
Like, this is the hardest question you guys have asked. Like, I don't
Mm-hmm.
know. I don't know what that means. And so I don't think there's any intent to explore that
Mm-hmm.
question in the creation of this relationship. But I do think it's good for us to consider, like, there are certain ways that we love a sibling or that we love a friend that we oftentimes exempt from our romantic relationships. And I think at the
Yeah.
core are actually supposed to be there.
Yeah.
The mutual concern for one another, the fraternal or familial concern that we're supposed to have for any woman that we love. I actually think there's a way in which that's modeled in Luther and Allison's relationship in
Mm-hmm.
an ultra bizarre
Yeah.
like way. But I think it draws our attention back to something
Yeah.
that can cause us to question or say this is hard, that our modern society just doesn't understand anymore.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's definitely kind of this splintering of the different types of love. In Christianity, we talk a lot about the 4 different types of love. There's Eros, the love of passion, and Storge, the love of family, and Philia, the love of friendship, and then Agape, the self-sacrificial love of God. And we often see a splintering of that in society where, I have a hookup buddy or an F buddy, or, where it's just all physical, but then I have like my friend where it's like, oh, we're just friends. Whereas really like a healthy relationship, like a healthy, like marital romantic relationship has a good friendship. And ultimately, if you're going to form a life together, you have to have that kind of brotherly, sisterly thing too. And it has to be integrated. And it all comes back to the self-sacrificial love, that virtue, that caritas, charity that you don't just feel for one another, but you put into action for one another. And it can't, real love doesn't survive on emotions. Real love doesn't survive just on desire. Desire goes up and down all over the place in any relationship. And what's going to sustain you and keep that desire going through the ups and downs and keep the real love going through the ups and downs is that love of sacrifice. So I love what you said. Yeah, it's gotta be integrated. And that's what's so damaging of when we see sex and romance as like, oh, this other thing. And it's not about having a healthy relationship. And then when people do try to have a healthy marriage, because they've treated sex as this other thing, that's something that's just for fun, or it's, oh, just for the desire, or, oh, just for the feelings I get, then they have a really hard time integrating. It takes a lot of healing. It takes a lot of sometimes work in therapy and that sort of thing, work with your spouse. So, yeah.
Yeah, and I think we see the mixture of a lot of the most toxic elements of misunderstood love in the relationship between Allison and Luther. But I also, like, Allison is a great character in her own right. She's not just Luther's romantic interest.
Yeah.
Again, I think her power is potentially the strongest. But also, I love what they do, because in the comic books, the character is not black. So it's not the race conversation is not an element of the comic books. And again, it wouldn't be based on some of when it was being written, how it was being written. However, the way that they place it in the show when they go back to 1960s Dallas, I grew up in Dallas, right? I grew up in North Dallas. I have friends who grew up in South Dallas and it was crazy watching it. Like, I lived with one of them for a year. He's an older guy named Marty. I lived with him and his wife named Tony for a couple of years. And he grew up in South Dallas, and he would have been growing up during the time the show is set, which is during a lot of the racial tensions, because South Dallas was the black community when I was growing up, but also more so in previous years. It had diversified a lot, huge Hispanic influence, Anglo influence had moved into the communities. Things were still, there were still different neighborhoods that were certainly not like integrated, not through anything other than this is families that have lived here for forever, and this is where people live. But you would go through Hispanic communities, black communities, white communities, going through South Dallas. Historically, that was the black neighborhood of the city. And so what they do to position her in the middle of that conversation around racial tensions in the second season is unique to the show and is, I think, beautifully well implemented. It draws a lot of the internal tensions of some of the hopes that people had during that time about
Mhm.
what the Kennedys might be bringing as far as change to our nation may have
Mhm.
implied, and the need to say, how do we cooperate with the powers of our government, and
Yeah.
then how do we challenge back, because this is our experience that we need to own. And I don't think there's a person in our country right now who shouldn't be able to, in some way, shape, or form, associate with that ideal of
Yeah.
how do I deal with what should the government be doing, and what do I as an individual need to do to speak out on my own behalf,
Yeah.
regardless of where you fall on the divide.
Yeah.
It should probably be a tension in your life right now. And I think the way they do that specifically around the conversation of race is absolutely phenomenally done within the show.
And it's interesting because Allison is so powerful, and there's such an interesting divide in this show, because for Five, who, as you said, is one of the most proactive, a lot of times for him, it's the ends justify the means. If I can protect my family and I can prevent this apocalypse, sure, I'll kill off a whole room of board members for the, what do they call it? The company that like runs the timeline.
The agency.
The agency. Yeah. Like he kills off the whole agency board of directors. So, you know, it's the ends justify the means is sort of morality. Whereas with Allison, she's like, even though she's working for this super noble cause of civil rights, and she's in the middle of it, and she could use her power to change this issue, she recognizes that, like, even if I use this a little bit, it's still wrong. Not only because of the temptation to use it more, but because I am like taking away another person's free will. And so she kind of has this rule for herself that she's not going to use it. And so it's very interesting between her and Fives. You almost have these two different moralities, and Fives is very utilitarian. The ends justify the means. And Allison is more just kind of, you know, if it's wrong, it's wrong, and it's a betrayal, even if I use it just a little bit, even if I use it for something good. And I just love that thematic. And you know, if you took a moral theology class, those are things that you would talk about: is do the ends justify the means, and how can we know something is wrong even without you know, independent of the consequences or the circumstances, and when is something intrinsically wrong? It almost makes me think of Lord of the Rings. You know, Sauron's great power was that he could bend people to his will. Yeah. You know, he could bend entire races to his will and corrupt their hearts. And we see, and that's kind of what the power she has. And you see her, she's this fundamentally good person, but she's given this incredible power with this temptation to corruption. And that's one of Thomas Aquinas' substitutes for God is power, right? This temptation to power. So yeah, I love that dynamic.
Just before anybody ats us later, which you're welcome to add us about other things, but it's in the comics it is just called the Organization.
The Organization, okay.
Given a name, and then it's the Temps Commission in the show.
The Commission, very good, very good. Thank you. Who should we talk about next?
Let's do Klaus, because he is actually, let's do Klaus.
Let's do Klaus. I did want to talk about Klaus.
So Klaus I love. Klaus is, I love the actor who does Klaus. He was in another
so
horrible superhero show called Misfits that I absolutely adored. And he is somebody, again, who's reluctant to use his power, who uses drugs as a numbing agent to deal with the fact that he constantly sees dead people around him all the time who are trying to get him to help. Yeah. It does let him communicate with his brother Ben and interact with him. But I love Klaus. I love Klaus because I see a lot of, I see Klaus as an emotionally weak character to start off, but he actually, I think, is potentially the most dynamic character as far as the character growth we see in the first two seasons. Yeah. Of him becoming really who he's intended to be in a more intentional way, and working through a lot of his own stuff of his own volition, of his own desire to do so, but almost never for the right reasons. Like Klaus is not a good character. Klaus is not a redeeming character. He is a sweet character, though. Like, he is somebody who literally just wants people to get along better and doesn't want to be bothered by the dead constantly. Like, that's kind of his primary motivations. But he's unwilling to do the hard work a lot of the time because of that.
What Klaus reminds me of is I've had several friends through the years that have struggled either with chronic pain or addiction or some sort of disability or some combination of the three. And I think he really brings to life on screen a way that you don't often see in popular media what it's like for somebody who's just plagued with this pain constantly. One of my best friends in college, she had a jaw disorder where, you know, she had to have her jaw surgically broken and wired shut, and she was on a liquid diet for a while. She was almost on these muscle relaxers, and super holy, awesome young woman. But it was such a cross for her to bear, and most for her to carry, and most people didn't even realize it most of the time. But she'd be chewing or talking, you just hear her jaw pop, and you know she was in so much pain, and just that has a real, you know. I'm like such a wimp, you know. If I got something on my fingernail from playing too much guitar, like it distracts me all day long that I have this little paper cut or something, or I skin my knee, and like just how susceptible our personalities are to the pain and discomfort of life. And I just see in Klaus, you see him sometimes deal in healthy ways with this pain that he always has, and other times you see him escaping into unhealthy ways. And it's like you can't really blame him, because, you know, if I was plagued with seeing dead people and hearing their stories of how they died or were murdered all the time, I might seek escape too. So I see in Klaus so many like little bits of people that I've known who have struggled with these kind of chronic illnesses in a way.
And we see Klaus kind of get thrown into initially like mental and emotional health issues. That's originally what he's dealing with. And then we see him strongly dealing with PTSD to do a time travel mishap. Then we also see him like start a cult at one point in time that actually becomes massively influential in the second season, which is a super enjoyable way to do it.
So funny, yeah.
But we also see what pulls Klaus out of being this hedonistic, because he is a hedonist, without a doubt, but weaker version of himself, again, is love. And it starts out as Eros, and it certainly isn't like necessarily an order like, hey, I intentionally want to love somebody, but due to some of the time travel things, he has the opportunity to save somebody he loves later on in the show before they die. And we actually see that push Klaus into a desire to be a better version of himself, to care for somebody, to sacrifice for another, to do what's right for another person, even if it potentially ruins his opportunities for a relationship with them. We see that being a major driving force in who Klaus becomes, and the dynamic shift we see from him at the end. And so it's a really interesting theme that just kind of pops in the second half of the second season really strongly. Again, is this love that's drawing him forward, and it would be from a church standpoint a really complex relationship to try to talk about in a lot of detail. But I do love that core aspect of that, the fact that his concern for another is really what's drawing him out. It's not the Eros, it's not the Storge, it's that agape desire to sacrifice for someone else that moves him back into becoming a clean, sober, better version of himself. And it's to make himself better, not just for that person, but because he knows he needs to be better to help that person. Like it's still an individualized choice. I love that.
I love that too. And I think you also see it some in his relationship with Ben, because Ben is dead, but he's still part of the show because Klaus can see him, and their relationship is so, it reminds me of some sibling relationships I know where one of the sibling has a huge burden and struggles really hard, and the other sibling is trying to love them through all the healthy and unhealthy ways that they're dealing with that. And, you know, Ben is well, we learn at the end, he doesn't have to be with Klaus, that he wasn't ready to die and go on to the next life, whatever that means in this show. But I love the relationship with him and Ben is so sacrificial and just in walking with Klaus, and sometimes letting Klaus experience the consequences of his actions and helping him to see, like, look, if you're going to act this way, this is what's going to happen, but other times really helping him and encouraging him. And so I love the brotherhood between Ben and Klaus. It just, and I'm excited to see now that in the second, they tease that in the third season, Ben's going to have kind of a bigger role. I'm excited to see what they do with his character.
So Ben is one of the characters we know the least about on either one, right? We know that he was part of whatever the public phase of the Umbrella Academy was, because he's got a name. We know he died. It's never addressed how he died.
Yeah, it doesn't say how he
died.
In
the comic books, it highly leans towards suicide as how he died. So we can actually start to ask the question of, does his concern for Klaus stem from a feeling of I abandoned my brother, like, and now I want to be with him because I shouldn't have, right? Like a sense of regret around that action. But it's unclear even in the comic books if that is the case. His actual power, because everybody's like, what is his power? Is it just shooting tentacles out of his body? Ben's body is a portal to a hell dimension, essentially. Like, so whenever we see those tentacles and stuff coming out of him, that is him essentially summoning demonic energy to rip things around. Now, that's all comic book, right? So whether that's actually the case in the thing, it's also an incredibly unpleasant sounding like power to have. My body can be ripped in half and demon tentacles can shoot out of it. Doesn't sound like a super enjoyable power.
No, not at all.
He is without a doubt the most emotionally stable of the characters, and he's like, I mean, I think he skips a lot of the family drama as everything falls apart, because it's basically like he can talk to Klaus, he can hang out around people, but he can't do anything. So that level of surrender around the inability to act directly on things, I think is incredibly powerful. And again, it's something that in the end of season 2, we see him overcome that. We actually are able to see Ben take action we had a little bit of hint of this at the end of season 1, but it becomes a main point at the end of season 2. Ben's ability to act in a way that dramatically impacts the world around him, even when he feels ineffectual or seems ineffectual. And a lot of it comes through his willingness to surrender his lack of material control, but continually engage his capacity for relational control, which I think is a lesson like that pretty much everybody could learn from. Like the only thing he has is his influence on one person or a few people. But even within that, he's able to act strongly and isn't constantly frustrated by, though does express frustration with his inability to physically engage in the way he might want to.
And there's a beautiful scene at the end of season 2 with him and Vanya, and where kind of through Klaus, he's able to reach Vanya when Vanya's like the government like trips her out on the LSD and her powers are going crazy and it's going to like end the world and cause the apocalypse. And Ben meets her and is able to like kind of say, you know, you're always our sister. You were always special. And I think that's just like a really tender moment. So talking about Vanya, I found sometimes I really didn't like her character and her character was totally lame. And other times I was like, yes, I love Vanya. she's so great. You know, and she in some ways is the most powerful. She can kind of like bend. She can kind of, she's almost like the Dark Phoenix in X-Men, where she's just like so super powerful. She might kill the whole world. But she doesn't, her powers were suppressed and she thought she wasn't special for so long. And you see like the weight that has on her, where she's like, she's number 7. She's the last one. She's the one with no powers, and everybody else got to go off and save the world. And she's just stuck at home, and she's even kind of crappy at the violin. And when she finally does come into her powers, there's so much resentment, and seeing her grapple with learning to forgive and heal and come to love her family and become a part of her family and be accepted by her family. And see her kind of lash out at her family because she wrote that book, that like tell-all expose that kind of pissed the rest of her family off. So it's really interesting just to see how she reacts to being this black sheep, kind of bastard child of the family that isn't as cool as the other ones. So
first of all, I think Ellen Page was perfect casting for this character. Like, I think she does a lot of what you need to be able to do well with a character like Vanya, who is going on really a sense, though they all are, Vanya is discovering what it means to be herself for the first time ever. An aspect of who she is for all of her history basically has been locked away. And she is discovering not only a power that she has, because they very much tie the power that she has to her confidence and to the essential reality of who she is. And I absolutely love the way that comes forward. And actually, like, I will say, though obviously there's a lot of misuse, a lot of sense of a lack of control. The way that Vanya comes to life is exactly the way that I see people come to life when they encounter the Holy Spirit for the first time. Like when they start to really operate in whatever gifting God has given someone, is the way that someone will come alive in that moment is absolutely the way that we watch Vanya come alive between the first and the second season. Like at the end of the first season, when she's about to explode and destroy the world, that that maybe, you know, like there's some saint quotes we could throw around there, like and Jesus says, I came to set the world on fire, and how I wish it was already burning. I don't think that's what Vanya had
Destroy
in
the
mind,
moon.
right? Like, yeah. So that was ending. The second season is really about Vanya realizing her essential nature and coming to terms with that, and even sometimes being afraid of that. I don't know how many people I've talked to who, some of whom have very subtle gifts. It might be a gift like you have, Mike, for music, or somebody else it might be a gift for administration, but in a very miraculous way, their ability to order things, you know. But yeah, I have other friends who have charismatic gifts for healing. And almost all of them, the first time they start exercising those, it is overwhelming. It is a little bit terrifying for them to pray for somebody and then all of a sudden have their back work, right? Or to pray for a need to be healed and to physically watch things snap back into place in front of them. Like, that's a pretty like mind-blowing thing when it first happens, and people are oftentimes overwhelmed by that. But as they start to integrate that or understand how they're supposed to operate in those things, the level of, this is a really weird way to phrase it, the level of becoming that people have a lot of the time, the level of just like entering into who you actually are, is 100% the journey that we see Vanya go through in the second season with her own powers. And even then we see the other people trying to abuse, manipulate, overwhelm her, distract her from that. And I just think it's such a thing to see that family, right, and that voice of knowing who you are in relationship with Ben being the thing that resets that. I think oftentimes when we get when we're afraid of basically our own power, and if you're not like Christian, you're like, well, I'm not going to have healing cures, whatever, that's fine. Like the amazing abilities that you as a human individual have, oftentimes our brothers and sisters are way better able to see than us, and are able to speak into that in a really intentional way. And we see that as a thing of resetting. And contrary to what common culture proposes, not even from a fully Christological standpoint that the faith totally backs us up, but from a philosophical standpoint, I firmly believe that identity is not something we choose, but something that we receive. And the primary way we receive that is in our relationships, right? So I'm first a son, second a brother, right? After that, I become a husband and a father.
Yeah.
Those relationships are all given to me by someone else. And they are the primary things that grant me identity, right? I can choose a lot of things about what I like or my preferences or other things like that. But my core identities are really gifted to me in a relationship. And I love seeing that as a core element of Ben's conversation with Vanya at the end of season 2 that resets her and allows her to really kind of fully integrate who she is into the world for the first time. Yeah. Wow. That's really cool.
Well, I want to talk just a little bit. We don't have a whole lot of time, but I wanted one thing that there's a big reveal at the end of season 2, spoiler, that he's like an alien and it kind of explains like some of his weirdness and his intelligence and how he seems to always be 2 steps ahead of everything. And, but he reminds me a lot. I don't know if you've read C.S. Lewis's The Space Trilogy. But the last book, that Hideous Strength, like he's kind of like the bad guy in this, where it's kind of like this intellect unhinged from like any sort of emotion or passion. It's just like straight intellect. And you see how that like just cold calculating reason kind of leads to some messed up things. And anyway, so that's what he reminds me of. Did you have any thoughts?
In a comment thread wrote Paralandra, which is the second book.
That's my favorite. I love that one.
Is fire, and The Hideous Strength, which is the third book, is dumpster fire. It is my least favorite out of the 3. But you're right. I mean, it's a totally spot on call out. The unhinged intellect. He's actually called the Kraken in the comic books is his name, because it's a reference, and it is secretly a reference to the fact that he is this squiddy alien creature.
Wikipedia lied to me. They said number 2. They said Diego was the Kraken. So
he is the Kraken, yeah. And so there, you know, in the it's a well, and I could be wrong.
Okay,
I think if he wasn't called the Kraken, he had a different name in the comic books. I'll Google
the monocle.
You can at me. No. Like the monocle was, I know it from the movie, but I think he had like an alien name that they brought up at some point in time. Cool. I'm gonna Google it. But no, I do. The character is incredibly interesting. I also just love somebody who's like, I'm going to go around the world and buy a bunch of kids, or get a bunch of kids, or take a bunch of kids, and then form them into something with no real sense of why they need to exist. But I actually think I love how they started this reveal right now in the series, because it sets us up for season 3 being able to explore some really intense things. It actually makes me wish, because they're again, this is the way that season 3 is being done in the show is different than the comic book. The time travel piece is central to the show. It wasn't as central, though it's very evident to how they tell the narrative in the comic books. So in the comic books, there's just been a secret school the entire time that the woman who Mother is based on has been running.
Oh, okay. Interesting.
It's just a separate school of 7 kids that he also controls, but he wasn't running. The woman who we see in season 2, who is the template for Mother, runs. And so it's really interesting the way they've done it with a time travel shift and split for this one. I'm super excited to see kind of how I think, get to explore who Reginald is a lot more for in the next season.
Yeah, me too. All right, well, we're just about out of time, Tony. And a lot of times at the end of an episode, I will ask the guest if they would close us in prayer, kind of reflecting on the themes. Would you be willing to do that?
Yeah, absolutely.
Cool. Very good.
Let's begin just in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit.
Amen.
Good and gracious God, we come before you, and maybe we are people who feel close to you. Maybe we understand our relationship with you. Maybe we're people who don't believe or don't know that you exist. No matter where we are at, or no matter who we are, help us to understand more clearly in our lives what a good Father is. We all experience wounds. I know I do from our earthly fathers. No matter how intentional or unintentional those wounds might be, they speak to us of a desire for something more, of a lack that we sense in our soul, a need for a love that means something more than we could possibly know. So, Lord, I would ask that it maybe in those lack, in those empty spaces, in those wounds, that we might realize that desire for something more speaks of who you are, that we might allow our brothers and sisters, those around us, to use their gifts to build us up, to help us see ourselves. And that, Lord, above all things, that love might draw us forward, that it might draw us into more. Help us to become the best versions of ourselves, by which I mean the individuals we were created to be, that you've wired into our hearts. That, Lord, we fully choose when we choose you. And we ask all this through the blessing of your Son. Amen.
Amen. Thank you, Tony, for being here. Tony, tell the beautiful people where they can find you.
I'm at Tony Vasinda on pretty much any social media platform. I'm an elder millennial, which means that I live on Facebook and I visit other social media platforms.
Me too.
On occasion, but at Tony Vasinda on anything. You can find Catholic Balmco at Catholic Balmco, or Plus One stuff, all the tabletop nerdy stuff I do at Plus One EXP. You can find all that stuff at TonyVasinda.com.
Very cool. You can find me at MikeTenneyMusic.com. You can find stuff about the show at AWAKENCatholic.org. You can also support this show and all the shows on Awaken Catholic by going to AWAKENCatholic.org and donating. A one-time donation, or even better, a recurring donation, become part of the Awaken Nation. You can download the Awaken app. And if you are, so you get a bunch of free content there. And then if you are part of the Awaken Nation, you also get premium content there, talks by me and some of the other show hosts and presenters as well. So that's a great way that you can support us. You can also support us by downloading the Hallow app through our site. Go to hallow.app/awaken and get that free month of premium. Not only will it help your prayer life, it'll help us out as well. And as always, you can help us in just kind of easy, free ways by liking this, hitting that bell on YouTube, subscribing, sharing on Facebook, sharing in a text to a friend, give us a rating on iTunes or Spotify, writing a review. All that stuff helps us out and helps us get in front of the eyes and the ears of more people. So thank you for supporting this show. You can send us comments and all those things. Thank you so much, Tony. Thank you to all you wonderful listeners, and we will see you next time.
This show and all media on Awaken Catholic is made possible by the Awaken Nation and the Hallow app. The AWAKEN Nation is a community of people like you who support all things AWAKEN for as cheap as a cup of coffee a week and get access to exclusive content. Learn more by visiting awakencatholic.org/donate. Hallow is the only audio-guided Catholic prayer app focused on contemplative prayer and traditional Catholic meditation such as Lectio Divina, Daily Examen, and the Rosary. We here at AWAKEN all use Hallow every day and love it. To learn more or give it a try, visit hallow.app/awaken.